right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for Let's Talk About It, the role of communication in climate work. My name is Francelis Murillo Suarez, and I'm a Clean Energy and Climate Planner 2 on the Clean Energy team at MAPC. I work on the Accelerating Climate Resilience Grant Program with my colleagues, Van and Kat, who are also on the call. So before we get started with our guest speakers, I'll go through a few quick slides on the logistics, and we'll give a brief overview of the speaker series. So after the speakers present, we'll have some time for question and answer from the audience. So please add questions in the chat throughout, and we'll be sure to note them for when we get to the Q&A section. All right, so do please remain muted throughout the event. And to use the chat, click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and hit enter. And if you have any Zoom related questions, please feel free to privately message my colleague Kat or Ann, and they will try their best to help with troubleshooting. Another note is if there are any disruptions to the speakers or the event, we do reserve the right to expel anyone at any point. Should they disrupt the meeting for any reason, in the event we need to end the meeting early because of a disruption, we will be sure to follow up with participants. Wonderful. So the Accelerating Climate Resilience Speaker Series is essentially a space to gather practitioners, both locally and nationally, and even sometimes like internationally, who can speak about the work they're doing in their communities with regards to advancing climate resilience via a range of many disciplines. So thanks to the Bar Foundation, who are our program funders, we've been hosting the speaker series for a few years now. So there's like a wonderful repository on our webpage of all the recordings of the webinars we've hosted. And some of our most recent webinars have included conversations on topics like clean tech, equitable engagement with community liaisons, and community gardens as a resilience tool. Wonderful. So again, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Please stay tuned for a couple more events happening this fall and winter. We'll be sending a very brief webinar feedback survey in the chat, and we hope you'll be able to respond, as we'd love to hear your thoughts about future topics. All right, well, that is enough from me. I am very excited to introduce our guest speakers who have joined us today, Dr. Kristin Timm and Dr. Sammi Munson. So Dr. Kristin Timm is a research assistant professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and lecturer with the Yale School of Public Health, specializing in climate change, science, risk, and environmental communication. She started her career as an environmental educator and science communicator, working with federal agencies and academic organizations. Her research focuses on how scientific issues are conveyed to diverse audiences and the people and processes at the interface of science and society. And Dr. Sammi Munson is an interdisciplinary scholar, which informs both her teaching and research. She started her career as an activist with Ohio Citizen Action, a social and environmental justice nonprofit. She then earned her MS from the Ohio State University in environmental science with an emphasis on public health, and her PhD in communication from George Mason University. Sammi currently teaches as a lecturer at Gonzaga University and Yale University. In addition to all this, they've also taught me all that I know about climate communication and are both wonderful individuals. So I'm really excited for you all to hear from them. Wonderful. So I'll pass it over to you both. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. We're really looking forward to talking with you all today. We'll just give a moment here for the slides to pull up on the screen.
Yes, thank you again. Looking forward to some great questions and conversation thereafter as well.
All right, there we go. So we'll be talking to you today about the role of communication in climate change work. We are going to breeze through a lot of things in a rather short amount of time. So as Sammi said, we're really looking forward to your questions and answers at the end of this presentation. And so we should have plenty of time. Also, because there are two of us, if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat and we can try to answer those as we go along. So next slide, please. So the key idea for the presentation today is that we can use strategic communication principles to more effectively communicate with diverse audiences about climate change. And I saw many communicators in the introduction. So some of these principles might be familiar to some of you, but we'll pull in a little bit of specific information about climate communication and how we can think about climate communication in the context of the strategic communication framework today. Next slide, please. So just to begin, a brief overview of where we're going today. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about why climate change communication is so difficult. So often when I start a presentation like this, I will pose the question, what are your worries? What are your fears? What causes you to maybe hold back from climate communication? And so feel free to, jot down a word or two on a piece of paper next to you. Just something that maybe comes to mind, and hopefully we'll be able to address that more today. The second key point we'll make today is around strategic communication. And so strategic communication is a framework that we can use to improve our climate change communication. And it's a set of tools really that we can use to better focus our work and to really be more intentional about the climate change communication work that we're doing. We'll specifically talk about centering our audience, and so we'll discuss some of the key characteristics of our audiences when it comes to climate change and how we can think about tailoring messages for those different audiences. And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about a few other communication considerations, including thinking about messages, thinking about what tactics or communication channels you might use, and some other tips and strategies. So next slide, please. All right, so first, why is this so difficult? Next slide. I really appreciate this quote from Daniel Kahneman. He's an author and Nobel-winning psychologist, and in a Hidden Brain podcast interview, he talked about how if you were to design a problem that the mind is not equipped to deal with, climate change would fit the bill. It's distant, it's abstract, it's contested. And so there are a lot of characteristics of climate change itself as an issue that make it just intuitively a difficult topic for folks to wrap their head around at times. Next slide. And there's many different facets to this. And so it's important to be thinking about this when we think about communication. Sometimes the barriers are the complex science and the jargon that often comes with talking about climate change. Even words like mitigation are not intuitive to most folks in the US population. Climate is abstract. So climate is technically defined as long-term weather patterns. So our understanding of climate, is just a snapshot in time as humans. And it's really those like much longer term patterns that tell us something about what's happening in the climate versus what's happening in the weather. So this isn't always intuitive to folks. Often climate change is perceived as a pretty distant threat or irrelevant. A lot of the early news coverage about climate change talked about polar bears and penguins and sea ice, which of course that's very relevant to where I live in Alaska, but for a lot of folks that feels like an issue that is somewhere else, far away, not relevant to me and my family where I live. There's also been a lot of misinformation and intentional disinformation that has been spread about climate change as an intentional effort to try to limit action and stop action on climate change. And of course, that creates a very polluted communication environment where people who are seeking information have to sift through what's factual and what's not. Climate science itself has multiple levels of uncertainty. So when we look at the actual physics of what's happening in the atmosphere, there's very little uncertainty around that. But when we start to think about how human systems will change, how policies will unfold over time, that's where much of our source of uncertainty occurs. And so it's difficult to give people, specifics about what the world might be like or what climate impacts might be like in our region 10 or 20 or 50 years from now. In the US and in some other countries, especially Australia and the UK, this topic has become very politicized. And in the US in particular, it's become very polarized, where your views about climate change are often closely tied to your political, ideological views. There's a very noisy communication environment. So I might be dating myself here, but I can remember the time when there was, 3 TV channels and 1 newspaper where my family went for information. Of course, now we have many more sources of information. And so as communicators, we have to actually cut through all of that noise if we're going to be successful. And then finally, it's often unclear to people what actions they should take. So if we, get to the point where people understand that this is an issue, it's important, it's affecting them and their lives right now, what should I do about it? And does that action actually feel equal to the size of the threat? So there's a lot of different layers of challenges, but we're going to talk about how to overcome many of these. Next slide, please. So our communication about climate change can have positive impacts. And so this is not a futile effort. There's a growing body of research showing that our communication is important. More conversations mean that there will be more acceptance of climate change, that it's happening, that it's human caused, as well as increases in worry. And worry is kind of the feeling that helps us feel like we need to do something. Given our current media environment, a lot of folks just don't follow climate-related news. And so our communication as trusted messengers, our communication with family and friends, all of that can reach less engaged segments of the population that aren't paying attention to that kind of information. So our communication can help overcome these negative effects of selective exposure, where we're just simply not exposed to information about climate change because of where we're choosing to get our news and information. And really having more day-to-day conversations are part of social change and help us sort of intuitively see what people think is important. So when we think about many of the issues of the day, whether that's inflation or healthcare costs, these things are things that folks talk about regularly. And so just in general, individuals, communities, societies, we generate awareness, understanding, care, and we act on climate change through our communication with other people. So it really is a critical piece of our work. So I'm going to turn it over now to Sammi.
Next slide, please. And thank you, Kristin. All right. So now that we've introduced why this is so difficult to do in the first place, and I'm seeing some of your expressions of that and your struggles in the chat already, we're going to get into the strategic communication framework to help us improve going over and doing this process. Slide, please. So think about if you've ever heard this quote before from Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. It's a pretty common one. It's one that a lot of people tend to have in the back of their brain, even if they don't know it's Maya Angelou. And we see this so commonly in the educational sphere, right? Where we think, okay, we're going to give people knowledge and information, and then they're going to make this gigantic leap into action. But unfortunately, that is seldom the case. And that's what we like to call the deficit model. there is just so much space in between knowledge and action. Think of examples perhaps from your own life, how you should, move your body every day, but maybe you keep skipping gym workouts, or you should eat more veggies, but you go ahead and get that fast food option anyway, right? Just some relatable conventional examples, not even related to climate change. Then add climate change and environmental issues to it. And with all of those obstacles that Dr. Timm just mentioned, making it big and abstract and complex, and you see in the chat, not being able to relate it to real tangible things in people's lives. And, we've got a bit of a tricky situation. Slide, please. And so we have all of these various obstacles, and this isn't even a comprehensive list, right? And some of them are going to be very challenging to overcome. Things like physical context. How am I supposed to bike to work if I live in the middle of a, concrete jungle full of highways where it's literally not safe to do so, right? But others of these can, in fact, be overcome. Things like social norms. What is everyone else doing around me? Well, I don't necessarily have to do that, even though, that's what's nice and common and comfortable. So figuring out what boundaries are insurmountable and are going to require, longer systemic, organizational, governmental, and policy changes, and which ones we can tackle maybe a little easier, maybe a little sooner overall. Next slide, please. So communication is oftentimes seen as this very one-directional thing, right? I have this thing in my brain, I have knowledge in my brain, and I want you to have it, and it's going this way, and that's it. But that's not actually the technical definition or what it should be, what we should be striving for. A really great definition adapted from Pearson and Nelson is the relational process of generating shared meaning. Communication is a two or even multi-way street, and that means that sometimes we need to take a step back from what we want to communicate out into the world and first figure out what the world needs. And that can be a very, very challenging step for a lot of us, but it really centers us in this space where communication is going to start as a listener-centered process. Next slide, please. So this is our strategic communication formula, if you will, not ours, the framework for strategic communication. So it goes through a process of determining goals and objectives, specifying the audience, then we move down to developing messages. Once we've got that, selecting our modes of communication, and finally, pilot testing, implementing, running our communication efforts. But as you can see, it doesn't stop there, right? It's a completely secular process where, okay, we did it once, and now we have to continue learning from that and continuing to do that over and over again, to make sure that we are being equitable and inclusive and taking things, one baby step and one win at a time and continuing with the work. Next slide, please. So we are going to start with where I started clockwise there on the framework, determining goals and objectives. So this first section, technically you could start anywhere on the circle, but it makes a lot of sense to start here in like the 1 o'clock on the clock. Starting out by just determining what is the outcome that you want to see happen from the communication, right? Do you just literally want people to know more things, become more aware or informed? Do you want them to do something, to take some sort of specific action or become engaged in some sort of existing process? Do you want to form relationships? All of these different things can be things that we do with our communication, but maybe not all at the same time. So I think that can be really frustrating for people to hear, that age-old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? We definitely have to take things in stride in order to do them effectively and do them well. Slide, please. So back over to Kristin, who's going to talk about our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Sammi. I actually, I was looking at Rachel's message here in the chat, and I was just thinking maybe we could kind of use this as an example as we move through some of the rest of the slides here. So we've already talked about kind of the first step of the process as I see it, but as Sammi said, you could start really anywhere. But if we're thinking about goals and objectives, one objective might be, if we're using Rachel's example from the chat, is that we want more residents of a city. We could make a specific name, more residents of a specific city to keep their trees on their property. And maybe that's our communication objective. So as we move into thinking about audiences, next slide, please. We are often thinking about our audience in really close relation to the goals and objectives. If our objective is to, basically encourage people to keep their trees on their property, we already know some really important things about our audience. We know that if we're going to be successful, we need to be talking to people who own property and have control over the trees that they have on their property. We might be talking to people who have the capability to manage the trees on their property, either because they have the tools and the ability to do that, but maybe it also means that they have the financial resources to actually work with somebody who can help them with the trees on their property. So next slide. So when we start thinking about our audience and conducting an audience analysis, here are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves. Why this audience? Why is this the most important audience that we can be communicating with? And this is an important question because all of us live and work in a situation of limited resources. And so we can't reach everybody. And so if we try to reach everybody, often that leads to uninteresting and flat content that doesn't actually connect with anybody. So we need to choose. And when we choose, we usually have to choose somebody, and that means we're ignoring somebody else. And that is just a harsh reality of the work that we're doing. What are the audience's goals and expectations? What kind of knowledge and attitudes are they bringing into the communication? So these are all important characteristics that we can use if we're thinking about communication from that relational perspective. We can use that information to try to meet them where they are. Are there any relevant demographics or other characteristics? So with the tree example, yeah, we might be looking for people who are landowners or homeowners. That's a really important piece of demographic information that's going to shape our communication effort. What are my audience's values and core beliefs? This is another place where we can try to connect with our audience. Values can also be a really important place to identify whether we need to bring in another communicator, whether there's a more trusted source of information that is already aligned with the values of the audience. And you might be thinking about other dimensions that relate to your audience, but it's worth taking the time to ask yourself these questions and think through, specifically who you're trying to communicate with. Next slide. And then really think about how to design for listening. So a couple kind of key bits of information here about listening is just that participants in general are more likely to see a process and a decision as fair if they feel that their perspectives were heard, regardless of whether the final decision aligns with their views. And so sometimes, we think we have a good enough understanding that we can just jump right to, the things that we want to say, but ultimately giving people that sense that they have some buy-in, that they've been heard, that their perspectives are being considered, is really important to our big picture goals and objectives. It's important to remember that a single opportunity to be heard might not be enough. And this particular work was done in the context of scientists who often rank listening as a pretty low priority objective. And listening affects the quality of the communication process as well as other outcomes like trustworthiness. So if you're working with audiences that might have a reason to feel distrustful of the work that you're doing, or the agency that you're in, or the organization that you're in, that makes listening that much more important, because it really relates to forming that trusting relationship. And you need that trusting relationship before you can really effectively communicate. And, this means actually listening, but also you can do a lot in your own communication to help show and communicate to people that they are being listened to. So that's one objective that you can work on in your communication if you're working with audiences where that trust is a limiting factor. Next slide, please. So where do you then go to find information about your audience? So of course, you can listen to people if you have the chance to do that. And there are other ways to develop an understanding of your audience. Some of these are pretty easy, low effort ways. Others are a little bit more involved. So you might be looking at publicly available data. You might be reflecting on what you've learned from your past communication with a particular audience. Oftentimes social media and publicly available communication can be really important. So, what is the community Facebook group saying about this? Has there been a needs assessment written in the past that used the public participation process? Those are all really good sources of information about your audience. If it's a really, small specific audience, sometimes you can work with a group of members, kind of informants that can help you better understand who you're talking with and what's important to them. If you're thinking about behaviors, you can watch the behaviors. So this is really great for publicly visible behaviors. You can see what are people considering when they perform that behavior. And then on kind of the more involved end of the spectrum, you can conduct focus groups or interviews or survey research. And these can be really fruitful places to collaborate with social scientists to help you collect that data about your audiences. Next slide, please. So I did want to share just one resource, the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. So you can go to these maps online, and essentially what has been done, there's been an effort by Yale and George Mason universities over the past, I think it's been over 10 years now, to collect national scale data on what people think about climate change. And so they've measured a whole variety of different dimensions of this issue. And what they have done is essentially downscaled this data to smaller units, so counties, metro areas, congressional districts. And so the downscaling is a statistical method. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it creates an assumption of the national scale data for that much smaller unit of area. So it could give you another tool in your toolbox when you're thinking about what the folks in your community or county or congressional district what they think about different dimensions of climate change. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sammi now.
Thanks again, Kristin. All right, so we actually just got this question in the chat, so it's a great segue. So what if you're thinking of something very big, very broad, like communicating at a state level? And the answer is, generally speaking, well, is that your smallest unit of analysis, right? There is, as I stated before, no shame in starting small, being successful, and growing your efforts from that point, right? Especially because if you're new to this and for whatever reason, you're learning, you might fail the first time. Like, do you want to fail small or do you want to fail really big, right? So taking the time to get yourself acquainted with this process and feeling really good and really confident about it is definitely something that I would highly recommend. So that brings us to what Kristin was talking about there with audience segmentation. Basically, making sure we get into our smallest unit of analysis that is possible and helpful. So, on that state level, I put in the chat there, as probably many of you saw, are you looking at, residents of rural areas, urban areas? Are you looking at policymakers? Are you looking at youth? Like, identify a starting point so that, as Kristin stated earlier, you can tailor and target that communication to be interesting and relatable to that particular section. What do they, as a subgroup, as a segment, value? So here are just a couple of different examples at the bottom: geographically, demographically, psychographically, which is always a fun word to say, of different ways that you can potentially think about segmenting a larger group, a larger audience. Next slide, please. Within climate change, we tend to look at our climate change communication from what's called the Global Warming 6 Americas, which started around the time that climate mapping that Kristin was just talking about did. I want to say the year was 2008. I don't know why that sticks in my head, but it does. And so these are our 6 different segments we've got. Some of you may have seen these before, others this may be brand new to you. We are going to go through them rather quickly and not in near as much detail as we could, but basically are alarmed, are going to care a lot about the issue, be very worried about it, and be acting upon it in some way. Are concerned are a basically diluted version of the alarmed. They are caring, but maybe not quite as much, and not doing as much, not behaving or acting as much on it. Cautious tend to think it's a problem, maybe a little bit less so far in, actually doing anything or knowing a lot about it, may question if it's human caused, a little bit ambiguous there. Our disengaged tend to not give it a lot of thought. It's not really something that's on their radar. The doubtful may recognize climate change is happening, but not believe it's human caused, and definitely they're not worried about it. And our dismissive, unfortunately, are the complete, obviously, other end of the spectrum from our alarmed, where not only do they not think it's human caused, it might not even be real to them. They're most prone conspiracy theorists or folks who are, actively taking action against climate change efforts. Next slide, please. But, oh my gosh, there's so much hope. Y'all, look at how many people care as of fall 23, as of just 1 year ago's survey numbers. So this is really encouraging. These numbers have gone up a lot over time and continue to today. So, you know, we continue to engage in this work so we can get more folks to be alarmed and concerned and further to the left on this particular spectrum so that the work can keep going. But making sure you know who you're talking to and how you can frame and tailor your message to a group of concerned folks versus a group of doubtful folks is kind of the essence of climate change communication. Next slide, please. And back over to Kristin to bring us home.
Thank you, Sammi. So next slide, please. So as we think about a few additional considerations for our communication, one of those is developing messages. And so you just learned about each of these different 6 Americas groups, and there are specific messages we can have in mind with each of those 6 Americas groups. When we think about our audience, we can, really think about the kinds of messages that might resonate with them. I did want to talk about one way that we can think about our messages, really thinking about where a large chunk of the population is. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the barriers that we have is just that a lot of folks do not see how climate connects to the things that are happening in their lives and in the places where they live. And so the Yale and George Mason University surveys have found that a majority of Americans are worried about harm from environmental problems generally in their local area, including things like air pollution, water pollution, electricity outages, extreme heat. But relatively few people connect these specific environmental problems to climate. And so if we're working with those audiences in the concerned segment, that still tend to see climate as something distant, this is one potential way that we can think about our messages to help them see this as a more localized issue. Next slide, please. And it's really important to connect around experience. It relates to our humanness. We're really designed for the kinds of threats that are just more experiential and obvious, that really kind of tap into our immediate processing. But often climate is presented in this more abstract way, like this graph. And that is not something that immediately shows people why it's relevant, why it's important, why they should care about it. And we can consider these same things when we think about solutions. A lot of the solutions, it feels very distant. It feels like it's happening at a much bigger picture level. But when people can see how things connect to their own lives and that things are already happening in their own regions, that can help create that sort of positive sense of efficacy, that we can do something about this. And I always make this joke about the culvert story. One of my colleagues here at University of Alaska Fairbanks has been working on climate models to help the Department of Transportation replace all their culverts so that they're big enough for the kinds of future rainstorms we might get. This is a pretty boring everyday kind of story, but it's also very incredible. The whole state is basically planning for this change in precipitation. And so these are the kinds of things that I think we could be talking about to help bring climate change a little bit closer to home. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sammi now.
All right, next slide, please. So when we select our modes of communication, almost all the way through the circle here, next slide, something we really want to think about is who is doing that communicating. who does our audience trust? Because there are many different dimensions of trust. There are lots of folks who really feel like trust should be warmth and relatability, things like that, as where there are other folks who really put a lot more value in knowledge and expertise. And so this is a particularly fun chart that was done back in April 2022 by that same consortium. And what we can see is that across the board, people generally really trust folks like really credible organizations, but then also people like their family and friends. And so we need to make sure that we are talking about these things, right? That we are making it more socially acceptable to just have these conversations, that a lot of people want to talk about these things, but they're afraid to. And so this is just a really interesting piece of data as to, one way we can get our communication across via some different trusted messengers. Also thinking about, our channels of communication along the way, meeting your audience where they're at with where they already get communication, whether that's on the radio or on billboards or, they'd prefer to be like flyered in the mail, email, whatever that might be, wherever they're already getting information. Going back to that audience research is a place that we really want to, capitalize on in making sure our communications to them match their preferences for receiving communication. Next slide, please. And over to Kristin to actually finish us out.
Yeah, so to wrap up, I actually saw a question about this in the chat. How do we actually evaluate our efforts? So we put all of this effort into thinking about our objectives, thinking about our audience, designing our whole communication campaign or effort. One of the most important things we can do, even if it's a very simple pilot test, is to actually pilot the work that we've developed. There have been way too many stories in the communication world of very large and expensive communication campaigns that failed to pilot test their work and actually had backfire effects. So they were not just unsuccessful, but they actually made their jobs even harder. So, take the time to share what you've created with some other folks and get their feedback. You can, if it's something, visual, you might be able to kind of do some A/B testing on a social media page and see how people respond. So there's a lot of different ways that you can make pilot testing pretty simple. And then, run your communication effort and think about the ways that you can evaluate it. So I mentioned this in the chat, I think, but if we're going back to that tree example, maybe you can drive around and you can see whether there is any difference in the number of trees between the time before you started your campaign and the time afterwards. If you're thinking about traffic and drivers, that's an observable behavior that you can look at. Of course, this is a little bit more difficult if we're thinking about how we our communication is focused on how people feel or how people think about a particular issue, because then you actually have to talk to people. That's not observable. So sometimes doing like a quick survey at the end can help you gather more information about whether your communication effort was successful. And I keep saying successful, but the purpose of setting objectives is not necessarily to determine if we are successful or if we have failed. If we start with objectives, we're basically making an informed guess about, how we think our communication work is going to proceed. And by making an informed guess and then collecting some information, that gives us a better position from which to reflect on what might have worked or what might not have worked. If we had an objective to, see a 25% increase in awareness about extreme heat, and our communication effort led to a 50% increase in awareness, sure, we might say that we're successful, but we also might ask ourselves, why did we really underestimate this? And that can give you information to better inform your goals and objectives the next time around. Next slide, please. And so this is often the point when folks are like, well, Kristin, Sammi, this is great, but I'm just one person in my organization, or I'm the one communicator. And I am a big fan of thinking about communication from a team approach. So a pretty well-known risk scientist, risk communication scientist, shared this idea back in 2007 that the best risk communication is the product of a team of content experts. So this might be your climate scientists, it might be your engineers, it might be your medical or health professionals, your public health professionals. So you have people who have that deep expertise in the content that might be central to your communication effort. Then you also have social scientists. And so these might be people who study how people perceive a risk, how people communicate, how people make decisions. And so they're going to be able to help shape your communication in ways that are informed by evidence of how people actually process information and make decisions and engage in new behaviors. And then you have communication practitioners and designers. These are the folks who, understand the different channels for communication, who can help, ensure that it's meeting audiences where they are, that the language is right, that the design is great. And then I also encourage folks to think about bringing in societal partners. So societal partners, might be, key members of your audience or really trusted messengers that that you want to engage in your planning from the very start, because they have a lot to bring to your effort. So you're not alone in this work. There's folks out there that are interested in helping and working together, and it can really make our communication efforts that much more effective. So next slide. So just to wrap up, coming back to our key idea. So we have talked about the strategic communication principles today as a framework to really pull in a lot of different information that's available about objectives, about our audiences, about the kinds of messages we can use and the kinds of channels we can use. So we're tying together all of those principles in this framework as a way to think about more effectively communicating with our audiences about climate change. So we hope that you were able to, pull a few kind of key ideas from this that might help you in your own communication work and thinking about how climate communication relates to the things that you do. So I believe we have about 11 minutes or so here for some questions.
Thanks all. Thanks, Kristin and Sammi. That was wonderful and a very informative presentation. I especially loved how you took like the tree example from an audience comment and embedded it live into your presentation. And I saw lots of great discourse and various discussions happening in the chat. So thank you to our audience for engaging in conversation with our guest speakers today. And I know we have limited time, as you noticed, so I'll jump right into questions so that we can get started. So it was great to hear about like the strategic communication information you went through. Here in our region, we have a variety of commonly spoken languages depending on the community. So I'm wondering, how do you center equity and language access within your communication work?
Sammi, do you want to start?
Sure. So equity is obviously super important, you know, now more than ever, right? We have so many diverse types of people and perspectives, and we want to make sure that we are being fair and inclusive. And so part of what you want to be able to do in the strategic communication process is go through this process iteratively, right? So maybe you're starting with, you know, the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest thing for you to do, especially if you're new to it. But that doesn't mean that you don't go around the circle again and again, right? And getting to those points where we're looking at more vulnerable populations, folks that need the help a lot more as well. And so keeping things really simple, as Kristin was saying in the beginning of the presentation, making sure that things are available in multiple languages if need be, making sure we're keeping jargon out of our communications so that things are relatable and understandable. Those types of things are so incredibly simple to do, and they get us a long way in the process. Kristin?
Yeah, I was just going to share the UN Declaration on Human Rights actually in one of their statements said, everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And so that quote really is kind of a grounding force when I think about communication and science communication and climate communication, because if we believe that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancements, then that really shapes how we make our decisions about communication. It's often easier to go to those easy audiences. And there's a place in society for like public science talks, but we know that often those are attended by folks who have the ability to, take an evening and go watch a scientific talk, and they don't need childcare, or there's a whole lot of different barriers to engaging in science when we start to look at the ways that it's often presented in society. And so I think there's a lot we can do in our communication to just ensure that everyone is able to engage in these conversations. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love that you are all also, responding to questions in the chat. I think there may be just one that you haven't gotten to yet. So, I guess, Sammi, you just put in a great. So yeah, someone was just wondering if there's any advice on like ways or how much to test out messaging or communications channels before actually rolling out like a campaign, for example. Sammi, if you want to know what you add in the chat, and then Kristin, you can jump in. Thank you.
I kind of wrote my piece, so go for it, Kristin.
Yeah, it's really tough, and I agree with Sammi. It depends on your scale and your resources. The main takeaway in my mind is just, at the very minimum, and I'll just speak from personal experience here. So here in Alaska, a lot of our science communication work, we're working with Alaska Native Indigenous communities. And one of the things that's really awesome is that I have several Alaska Native colleagues, and, I can share something that's been developed with them and say, hey, do you think we got the tone right on this? Can you just give this, another set of eyes? And, and so that's pretty easy and simple, and it doesn't involve, sending something out and having a whole survey and pilot testing. So that's really useful. And just as a team, we try to sort of build our internal capacity to listen and better understand what's important to the audiences that we serve. So, we also really try to frame our communication around assets, rather than being deficit based. And so that's something that, we've all just really worked on as a team based on the things that we've heard. So it's not necessarily a pilot test, but it is, it's part of this sort of ongoing communication and listening and responding to each other.
Thanks, Kristin. Yeah, it's a wonderful example. And I also really want to be mindful of time. I know you all have also been responding to things in the chat, so I really appreciate it. I'll do one final closing question if that sounds good to everyone. So quick lightning round. What is it in your work that brings you joy? And, for those attending, if you want to answer the question as well, feel free to add in the chat. And also, is there, what do you see next in the space of climate communication?
I'll go ahead and start. So what brings me joy about doing this work is literally just being able to help people accomplish their goals, right? We all have different goals within this very similar sphere, right? Climate change is so big. Many people call it, the biggest problem of our world, of our time. And I think they're correct in that statement in a lot of ways. But we each have our individual parts to play in that, whether you're a medical professional or you're a city planner or you're just like a stay-at-home mom who wants to have a really clean and safe household. And so regardless of who you are or what your goals are inside of the climate change sphere, this is applicable to you in some way, shape, or form. And so getting that out there, not just the information, but the application so that people can apply these concepts and implement them in their real lives is what really personally keeps me going.
Yeah, and I'll add, I've worked in this space for quite a long time, and I can remember a time when, we only talked about the physical science of climate change. And, I think what's really exciting is just how much we're talking about the social science now, because it really is a human issue. And so I found that for a lot of folks, they still think primarily about the physical science and like the impacts of climate change, but when you share some of this information about the social dimensions and the solutions and how we can like apply what we understand about people and policy to these kinds of situations, it feels like it unlocks a new level in the game, and people are like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like I see a new way I can do my work. And I think in terms of a future direction that's really exciting is just, I see more of this move towards like a team approach, rather than hoping that somebody will communicate the work, that, people are really like starting to take this seriously, and it's starting to get the resources that it deserves.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I love hearing about what brings you joy, and as well as like what the future can hold. Yeah, I want to thank everyone as well. I know it's almost 1 for joining us today. Please take a minute to fill out the feedback form if you're able. Folks can find the recording of this event on our webpage soon. And again, a big thank you to you both and a virtual round of applause, to our wonderful guest speakers. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks again for all the wonderful discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for joining us.